Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin, and we have Jonathan here,
Hello.
and we're wearing the same clothes.
Well, I changed actually.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm wearing the same clothes, and that's because we're doing a pre-recording. We want to try something different, where we pepper in a few issues where we sort of dive in and figure out, well, how do we get to here? What is something that we see in our political system now where it just seems crazy? Like, why is it the way it is? And we want to take a look back and see how we got there, because I often think that young people just don't know how we got here. And older people, they understand what once was, but then they don't adapt to the change. And we kind of want to bridge all that together.
It fits in very nicely. We talked about the courts earlier today. I've since had a workout, so I needed to have a shower and change. So that's where we are. My big mistake, though, is I forgot we were going to do 2 episodes in one day, so I only had one new beer handy. So no new beer tonight. It's also pretty late, and I have to get up early in the morning to teach. So we're going to go without the sipping today. Get right into the substance. Justin is going to go be a decadent capitalist and go relax in Hawaii for a while. So we're filming an extra one today.
So the issue that we want to talk about is the politicization of not just the Supreme Court, but the judiciary as a whole. Because it wasn't that long ago where you just were confirmed unanimously or just through unanimous consent. It was just a voice vote. And yet now, even at the district level, every appointment is a fight to the death. And so we want to figure out, well, how do we get there? And what we can do in the future.
Yep. So I think it makes sense to start with, well, where are we at now? How would you best describe what's going on? I think one of the important things to note is that you can't use the filibuster anymore on judges or justices at any level. Supreme Court justices, strict majority vote, 50 votes, and a vice president is enough to get a justice in. And I think we shouldn't underestimate what this means, right? When you have the threat of a filibuster, it requires you to compromise with the minority party, unless you have a huge majority, which doesn't happen very often. And so, one way or another, presidents had to figure out a way to at least mollify or appease the minority party enough so there'd be a compromise, or the other party, because the other party could be in charge of the Senate, in which case you definitely have to compromise. Or the other party would have enough to filibuster, so you just have to make sure that they're not completely upset, right? And as you're saying, for a long time, the president would make a selection with that in mind. The Senate would confirm, knowing that they had that in mind, and that's pretty much what would happen. But now, with the filibuster removed and the politics more to the fore, you don't have that at all. Like you said, everything is a knockdown, drag-out political fight.
Okay, so I want to use broad strokes here. Historically speaking, the courts have been more conservative, not from like a political sense, but they tend to pump the brakes. So throughout American history, the courts have always been like oh, wait, hold on a minute, that's not constitutional. And during the Warren Court, which started in the 1950s, that was the exception to the rule. And that's when you had a lot of landmark victories that liberals really cared about. So think Brown versus Board of Education, Miranda versus Arizona, and then Loving versus Virginia, which made it so that interracial marriage was legal throughout the country. And you had all these victories, and the conservatives, the Republicans, looked at these victories and they said, well, why can't we use the courts to enact our agenda as well? The courts actually have a lot of power. And it's not just saying no, we can actually shape policy through the courts. And so Nixon, he actually ran against the Warren Court, which is really interesting. And given the electoral results from 1968 on, naturally, the Democrats are going to have catastrophic losses on the courts. From 1968 until 1992, you had one Democratic president, and that was Jimmy Carter. And guess what? He had no Supreme Court appointments. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think one thing we also ought to mention is sort of a real, probably the biggest animating factor for conservatives wanting to push back would be the Roe v. Wade decision,
Right.
right? That really started spurring conservative activists to get going. It was the beginning of the incorporation of the religious right into the Republican Party, and a lot of impetus for wanting to pursue conservative justices getting onto the court. And so it's what's actually kind of interesting that the court wasn't further right than it ended up being, because Nixon and some Republican presidents ended up picking a number of justices that are far more left than I think they were expected, and it just kept the court in line with the way that Nixon, I believe, appointed Stevens and Blackmun, and then was H.W. Bush appointed Souter, and there was a lot of Republican angst about these things that go down the road because they weren't conservative like they were supposed to be. And the Republicans and the conservatives were really pushing to get the court more conservative to counter things like, for example, the Roe v. Wade case. And they really got sort of agitated after Democrats started pushing back on this. Famous example is Robert Bork being rejected from the Supreme, or being opposed enough from the Supreme Court that he did not get on. And that was an interesting one to me, just because there's a lot of interesting circumstances around it. It wasn't necessarily he's just too conservative. He's very conservative, but he also had the unfortunate baggage of being sort of carrying water for Nixon and firing prosecutors to try to keep Nixon in power. So when you'd think would get a little pass from the Republicans, but apparently not.
Yeah, and Bork is something that Republicans really point to as some sort of, oh, this was so offensive, it was norm shattering, all this and that. And the reality is, Robert Bork was a really intelligent dude. But again, as you said, having that baggage from the Saturday Night Massacre and the fact that he was just as conservative, if not more, than William Rehnquist, that was enough for him to just be, as they call it, borked.
Yep. And again, you would think if you took a society that you didn't know what was going on and you said this person helped a impeached president fire people to try to stay in office, do you think he should be on the Supreme Court? You'd like to think most people would say that's probably not a good idea. But again, politics is creeping in more and more and more as we move closer and closer to the present.
But even with Bork, it still wasn't that political. So after Bork, the next controversial nominee was Clarence Thomas. But if you look at someone like Antonin Scalia, who was appointed in 1986 all the way through Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they were confirmed with an overwhelming majority. I believe Scalia was unanimous, and so was Ginsburg, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like that. And I think it's useful to point out, even though Republicans complain about how, certainly did at the time, how Clarence Thomas was treated, he was put on the court only by support of Democrats, right? If without Democratic support, he's not on the court. So it was much more contentious than any confirmation that I was familiar with at the time, even more contentious than the Bork confirmation, I think. But Democrats got him over the finish line. So there was still room for sort of cross-party considerations at that point. Something we don't really see right now.
Right. And another interesting aspect is Thomas was confirmed 52-48. That doesn't even make sense in this day and age, because we always associated, well, you need 60 votes in order to get over the filibuster. But these things were decoupled back in the day.
Yeah, the filibuster was to bring the vote.
Right. And so people would say, you know what, I'm not going to vote for Clarence Thomas, but I'm not going to filibuster him. That's unthinkable. And that's the way things used to be.
But again, at the time, the Democrats were in the majority, so they would not have had to filibuster if they really wanted to get rid of him. But again, we've gotten rid of the filibuster, so that's not a thing at all.
Right.
And parties are less and less likely to want to compromise.
So We said that the filibuster wasn't really used to torpedo nominees. That started to change during the Bush administration. And I would argue that the Democrats here drew first blood, so to speak. It was unheard of to use the filibuster to torpedo a nominee. And the first one to be filibustered was a circuit appointee named Miguel Estrada.
Well, the thing I want to say about that is that here again we have a situation where the president is one party and the Senate is the other, and the politics are starting to really creep in, and in that the president puts up nominees that he has a pretty good idea that the Democrats are going to oppose, wants to see if he can ram it through.
So, why is this important? Why do we care so much about someone on the appellate court getting filibustered? Well, he was going to be, so Miguel Estrada was going to be appointed to the DC Circuit. And the DC Circuit, for those of you who don't know, is sort of like a pipeline to SCOTUS in terms of you have a lot of justices there, and they tend to be on the short list for Supreme Court nominations.
So if we want to, if you watched earlier, the episode that we filmed earlier in the day, we had a good sports metaphor to try to explain things. You can think of in baseball terms, the DC Circuit is like AAA. It's just a step below the major leagues, which would be the Supreme Court. And a lot of people get promoted to the AAA DC Circuit, and then the next step for a lot of them is going to be the major leagues. And the Democrats didn't really like the idea of this guy taking a spot in the Supreme Court. So they did not want him to get to the DC Circuit. Again, very nakedly partisan political kind of games, right? Very much in keeping with the political spirit that's bubbling up more and more in the court system.
So the Democrats saw this as an ideological battle. They wanted to preserve Roe v. Wade. And the way the court was composed, it was 5-4 with Sandra Day O'Connor being the swing vote. So they felt that if she retired, the next person is going to get Roe v. Wade overturned. And so the Democrats wanted to attack the pipeline to the Supreme Court. And the Bush administration knew this. So the Bush administration, their line of reasoning was, okay, let's get Hispanic, women, and Black conservative justices in the appellate courts so that we have a strong bench, so that whenever we have a vacancy in the Supreme Court, we can choose some of these people who are going to be a lot harder to torpedo politically speaking.
Right. Again, the politics is there at the fore. The thought is, hey, the Democratic constituencies are Black, Hispanic, and women. If we appoint Blacks, Hispanics, and women, they'll have a hard time explaining that, selling that to their base, why you don't want to have an Hispanic justice on the Supreme Court, for example. And they're probably right about that. One example you can look to would be, say, Clarence Thomas, right? It was harder for a lot of, especially sort of Southern state Democrats, to kind of still appeal to more conservative Democrats of the time, as well as the Black population in their states. Clarence Thomas eventually made his way through, even though at the time he was a very controversial candidate and still kind of controversial to this day. For no small reason, the fact that he's still on the court today. That was also the start of a push for Republicans to name really young justices, which they've continued today, so they can be on the court forever. And the fact that Clarence Thomas is still on the court is certainly would blow the minds of anybody from the original founders of the Constitution, despite the fact that Thomas considers himself an originalist.
So why this obsession about Estrada? I think the issue is he wasn't just some token Hispanic guy. He was someone who worked in the Clinton administration, and he was well regarded. The ABA rated him unanimously well qualified. And I think that's what made it much harder and more offensive for the Democrats to filibuster him.
And I think it is important to talk about, this is basically the first blood, as you said, for filibustering. And the importance to me isn't the actual case, because I don't think it really matters all that much. It's certainly down the road where we are. But Mitch McConnell still is very, very astute at really maximizing the potential of something Democrats might do, right? So once this seal has been broken, McConnell is all in on filibustering Obama's nominees. When Obama came into power and had a Democratic Senate, didn't stop Mitch from wanting to work with him at all, and he went out of his way to stop as many of Obama's appointees as he could, to the point where the Democratic Senate, the majority leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, decided he would get rid of the filibuster for all judges short of the Supreme Court. And don't know why he stopped there, because as you had to, McConnell warned that this is not going to last, and it didn't. The Republicans did the same, got rid of it when it came to the Supreme Court. So basically, it just became a political free-for-all for any judge and any justice. If you have a majority, you can ram through your judge or justice, and the other side can't do anything about it. And the era of compromise is pretty much completely dead.
Right. And I think that's like an important marker that Harry Reid, who was the Democrat majority leader at the time, he went ahead and got rid of the filibuster. We call that the nuclear option. Now, when Estrada was being filibustered, he wasn't the only one. There were several other nominees. So again, women, black women, so on and so forth. The Republicans threatened to use the nuclear option as well once they had the Senate majority. But you had this Gang of 14 compromise, and things kind of simmered down. And you had folks like Alito, who only got on the court, 58-42, something like that. Again, not filibustered. The Supreme Court nomination was not filibustered. Successfully, I should say. Obviously, John Kerry and company tried to filibuster Samuel Alito, but he failed in that regard.
The other option, the other avenue for like compromise, right? When the filibuster's gone, then if you're in the minority and the president has a Senate in the same party as him, no compromise necessary. They just ram people through. The other avenue, though, we have for compromise is if the president and the Senate are different parties, and then presumably you're going to compromise. Anyway, McConnell really embraced this. And so, as we said, he just filibustered whenever he could. And this same attitude that McConnell had when he was in the minority about filibustering everything carried over to when he was in the majority, and sort of bringing in an era of no cooperation. So as majority leader, Obama had 70 nominations that he sent to the Senate, and McConnell only presided over the confirmation of 20 of them, right? There's absolutely no spirit of compromise here at all.
Right. And I think if you're a Republican, yes, you can blame the Democrats for drawing first blood. But as I said in the last episode, you got to call a spade a spade. And if the Democrats are the ones who brought a gun, McConnell brought a machine gun. I don't think you can, in good faith, look at what McConnell did and say, oh, yeah, this is just tit for tat. McConnell clearly escalated. When you talk about the fact that only 20 judges were confirmed out of 70, based on our research, that was the lowest in, 40, 50 years? Like, that's unquestionably an escalation.
Well, and he made no bones about it either, right? He was very, very straightforward. That we're going to do everything we can to work against him and not confirm his judges. And there you have it.
And then with the nuclear option, there were more successful filibusters of judicial nominees during that era from when Obama was president than the rest of the Senate combined throughout history.
Yep.
So again, that just shows you the level of obstruction.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then again, we can get to the most famous example is McConnell's obstruction of the attempted appointment of Merrick Garland to fill a Supreme Court seat, the Scalia seat. And here you have Mitch McConnell just refusing to even give the guy a hearing, right? He's like, we are not going to bring him to the floor. We're not going to let people vote on him. It's just not going to happen, right? And it was unheard of, pretty much, for this to be a thing, right? It wasn't the longest time for seat to go unfilled. It was the longest in modern history, anyway.
It was a long time. And the funny thing is about this, everyone expected Obama to pick, some liberal justice, right?
Yep.
But and Chuck Grassley, who was head of the Judiciary Committee at the time, he's like, oh, you know what, Obama, if he appointed someone like Merrick Garland, that would be fine. And at the time, Merrick Garland was the Chief Justice of the AAAs, as you would say. And you know what? Obama called their bluff. He said, yeah, I'm going to pick Merrick Garland. Look, I like a conservative Supreme Court. I was not happy that Scalia died, but I am also a
I don't know
pragmatist.
that Democrats necessarily cheered on the death of Scalia.
No. But I mean, if you're talking about the raw
I know what you
politics
mean.
of
I know
things,
what you mean. Yes.
I saw Merrick Garland as like, you know what? Could be a lot worse. And with Hillary about to win, you know what? I'll take that bet. Now, obviously, history did not go that way. Trump ended up winning, and I guess you could say that McConnell made a really good bet. But Garland was a fine pick.
Yeah. And again, it's just, you talk about sort of the funny odd, not necessarily funny haha aspects of it.
Right.
His major reasoning was, well, this is an election year, we have to let the people decide. Conveniently, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away right before Trump's term was over, hey, we don't need to let the people decide. We're going to go ahead and put in and ram through a new conservative justice, so we can now have a 6-3 court. So again, being a hypocrite never seemed to bother Mitch McConnell, and he embraced it again, full on.
Yeah, that was really spitting in the face of Democrats. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is probably the favorite justice of millennial liberals, right?
Sure.
It's probably accurate. And she died September of 2016.
People were already voting.
Yeah, people were already voting. It was just nakedly partisan. And again, like, I think Amy Coney Barrett is a fine justice, but if you want to have a court that rises above politics, appointing people in this manner is just going to delegitimize the court. And that's effectively what's happened.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Let's use another cliche. When you say, if you want an apolitical court, I don't think they want an apolitical court.
No.
I think they want the most political court they can to carry out their own agenda, right? And I think we're in a time that there's not going to be any cooperation. I can't see, if Democrats take over the Supreme Court or the Senate in the midterms, I'd say there is less than zero chance that they would confirm any justice for Trump, right, if a vacancy came up in his last 2 years. By the same token, if for whatever reason we have a Democratic president next and a Republican Senate, I would be very surprised if over the course of 4 years, if Republicans confirmed any justices for vacancies that opened up. We seem to be in an era where, as you say, the court has become political. And that's a problem, again, as you said, because people are starting to clue in on this, and they don't see the court as a legitimate, sort of adjudicating body that looks at things on the merits and decides. People are starting to look at it as the political beast that it is. Like, oh, they're Republicans, of course they're going to vote for this way. Oh, they're Democrats, they're going to vote this other way. And we're setting ourselves up to just have more and more and more of that.
Right. And, if we look back at the start of this episode where we talked about the Warren Court, it all comes down to power. The court has become a powerful instrument to enact policy. And once the Republicans saw how successful the Warren Court was in getting liberal stuff passed, I shouldn't say passed, but adjudicated on, the Republicans pounced and they used this power. And really, the only way you're going to solve this is if you take power away from the courts. So why do the courts have power? It's because there's a vacuum and the courts have filled it. The president can't compromise with Congress. So the president tries to do stuff and the courts say, no, you can't. And this is the way it needs to be. And Congress isn't passing laws. Well, someone has to do it. And the courts have sort of taken it upon themselves.
Yeah, they've been. It's been a. I mean, we talk. You talk about sort of courts being conservative traditionally,
Mhm.
and now the conservatives have a majority, certainly in the Supreme Court, but they're a very, very activist
They are
conservative
activists.
majority. They're doing things that traditional conservatives would never have done. They throw precedent out the window like it's yesterday's fish, right? It's a very, very politically motivated court, and so it's acting to fulfill its political goals, right? And then, as mentioned a minute ago, we're kind of in an impasse. It doesn't look like things are going to get any better, because neither side is really motivated to do anything when it's in power, right? Um, for all the problems we can talk about with the Joe Biden presidency, at least he looked into some sort of court reform. It was court reform that probably would have helped Democrats more than helped Republicans, because Republicans had the majority on the court, right? Um, so it's hard to see how we're going to get anywhere unless a party in charge decides, you know what, we need to calm this down. We need to cool the temperatures. Let's get together and start to figure out how we can make the courts less political. But it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon.
No, my greatest fear is that the courts lose so much legitimacy that you end up having someone like a Trump who looks at a court order and says, well, you're not legitimate. So why do I need to follow it? And then
Which
what?
would be especially ironic since the court is basically a hand-picked Republican court.
Right.
But yeah, I think that is the real. If people don't think the court is legitimate, then you're right. They're not going to complain as much if an executive says, I don't think so. And as we've talked about ad nauseum, I'm sure, Trump seems like he might be headed that way.
So I think one of the good reforms is sort of this top-down reform. Yes, you have the district courts and the circuit courts, but it's really the Supreme Court who has the final say. And if you look at how the Supreme Court has been appointed, there's just been a lot of luck involved. So as we mentioned before, Jimmy Carter got 0 justices appointed. Trump, who had 4 years, had 3 justices appointed. So,
well, there was a little chicanery involved there, to be fair.
For sure, no question about that.
He probably should have had one.
But even so, it's one of those things where it's just luck, right? And I think one thing that would help bring the pressure down is just having consistency. And the only realistic way where you're going to get consistency is if one party is just going to win a bunch of elections and it's going to end up flipping the court. So in our case right now, we have a 6-3 conservative court. The Democrats are going to have to win, say, the next 4 elections, right? And then the Democrats are going to have to be the ones who say, all right, look, we're the ones in power. We're going to offer you an olive branch. And we're going to offer you consistency, where every president is going to get 2 appointees no matter what. So each justice on the Supreme Court is going to have an 18-year term. And once your term is up, you're still technically a justice, but you go to senior status. So that's one of the reforms proposed by the Biden Commission. That was actually our first podcast where we talked about it. But again, I think having that top-down approach is it's a necessary condition in order for everything to filter down to the circuit and district courts.
Yeah, I think because that would be a great benefit if we could kind of remove the contention from the top. Because right now, when things are so blatantly political as they are, because there's such high stakes, well, you got to find these people from somewhere, right? And so you look at the appellate court justices, you look at the circuit court judges, and you see who's reliable in our political persuasion. And so you encourage these people who have aspirations to move on to be as extreme as possible to catch the attention of the people who are selecting judges and justices for higher roles. So if we get rid of that, that would be great. I'm still not optimistic. Let's put it that way.
No, we should be optimistic.
In addition to winning the presidency, say 4 times in a row, then Democrats would also have to have the Senate, because as I said a minute ago, the odds of having nice, um, agreeable confirmation processes with a Republican Senate and a Democratic president, especially if it's a Democratic president for, say, the next 16 years, Republicans are going to be very feisty, let's say, in the way they oppose any Supreme Court justices, because they'd be fighting a sort of a last ditch attempt to hold on to something, and you're not going to want to give up that 6-3 supermajority under any circumstances.
And I think another good reform would be to handle this nationwide injunction stuff in a bit more thoughtful way. Because as you said, you have a lot of people who are basically auditioning for a promotion by coming up with whatever rationale that's fitting the party line at that moment. And so
Somebody
again,
like, say, our favorite Judge Kaczmarek, who for whatever reason we happen to know his name
right.
from being a judge in the middle of nowhere in Texas.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence.
And that's the thing. We shouldn't know who these people are, right? There's no reason to. There are hundreds of district level judges. And so if we're hearing about them, they're doing something really wrong from a not necessarily ethical sense, but from like a temperament sense.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you can say that a lot of them aren't acting in good faith. But to get to a point where that's not a thing, we do need something, like you said, where something has got to happen. Something needs to change in the way that we're incentivizing these parties to pick judges and fight for the positions on the Supreme Court, like it's life and death. And then for some people, these issues can devolve into that. So it's always going to be an important issue for people. But right now it's an issue where there's absolutely zero compromise, and that doesn't help the country in any sense.
So I think that's a pretty good place to stop. We really want to just show, how we got here, right? The
Yep.
court system that we have right now, it's not good. It could be a lot better. But what it really boils down to is power. The Congress has abdicated its role in a lot of ways, and both the executive and the judiciary have filled that vacuum. And the presidency is the vehicle for filling the judiciary.
Yep.
And so once you realize you can exercise power through the judiciary, well, then you've politicized the court.
Yep. Especially in this era, as you're saying, where Congress is sort of stepping back, Congress has turned into essentially a rubber stamp for its own party and just an implacable opposition for the other party. Right? There's just we're in a situation where we need to have some sort of compromise, but the parties aren't anywhere close to being ready to do that yet.
So anyways, I'll enjoy Hawaii while you guys are listening to this episode. So make sure you like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you next week.
Right. Bye-bye.